If you have your Bible, you can open it again to Genesis 21. And if you remember, last Sunday we went through verses 1 to 7. Now this Sunday we're going to still not finish the chapter, but we'll go from verses 8 to 21. Let's begin reading with verse 8 here. So Isaac was just born, right? And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on that day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Let me not look on the death of a child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with a bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So that's our text. And as you know, we've been walking with Abraham and Sarah for a while now, through many long years of waiting for that promise that seemed at times impossibly delayed, like it would never come. And at last, if you remember, before I left, in the opening verses of this chapter, we saw the laughter of Sarah in fulfillment, who once laughed in disbelief, but now laughed in delight. The son of promise had been born. God had done exactly as he said he would, right? But as we read on to this Sunday, the laughter in Abraham's household begins to sound a little strained. The joy of promise fulfilled is soon mingled with the pain of family tension. Right? Because there's another boy in his tent, an older boy named Ishmael, the son born of Hagar, the Egyptian servant. And we were here also in Genesis 16. Remember, Ishmael was Abraham's attempt to help God along with the promise, right? That didn't work out so well. He was waiting and didn't want to wait anymore. And so he had a child through Sarah's servant, Hagar. So he thought God was too slow giving him an answer, and so he was going to help God out with his plan, right? And it didn't go well. And now as the two boys grow, the consequences of that earlier decision come home to roost. Right? And verse 8 tells us that Isaac has reached the age of weaning, right? Which is probably around 3 years old. You could say 3 to 5. And Abraham holds a feast to celebrate this, right? So by all measures, it should have been a moment of joy. And then Sarah looks over and she catches a glimpse of Ishmael not taking it seriously. Right? Maybe it's mockery. Maybe he feels a sense of rivalry. Whatever it is, it reignites this jealousy that she feels. And in a moment that really, as the reader, feels very human of her, quite honestly, she turns to Abraham and she says, "Cast out this slave woman with her son." Right? She says, he's not to be an heir alongside Isaac. And to modern ears, that sounds really brutal. Right? You know why? Because it is. It is really brutal. However, there is some context to at least help out with this. In the ancient Near Eastern household, things like inheritance and status were bound really tightly to bloodlines and covenant promises, right? So she's not trying to be a Karen, so to speak. She's not trying to be persnickety. She's protecting the line through which God, through God's promises, God's covenant will run. Right? She's being a protective mom, really. Now, that said, the emotional cost for Abraham is also obviously enormous, right? Because it says he's very displeased, and rightly so, right? Because Ishmael's his son too, right? And so God intervenes here. He assures Abraham that his promises will stand, and that Isaac is indeed the child of promise. And yet God says that he will also bless Ishmael for his sake. And it's sort of God's way of saying, Abraham's very displeased with kind of both sides, where it's like, I understand where she's coming from, but this is my son too. And so there's just this real frustration that you feel as the reader. And God steps in and intervenes, and he says essentially to Abraham, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." Right? So he says, just listen to Sarah. I'll send him off. I'll bless him, but I will bless him in his own right, while maintaining my covenant with you through Isaac. And so, kind of heavy-heartedly, Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away into the wilderness of Beersheba. All right, so still, even though you, as the reader, you see that God has a plan here, it's still a really sad and haunting picture you have of this mother and her son being cast out into a desert. And they don't know. It's like, we know that God has a plan in this moment, but they don't know. They don't feel that at all. All right, so it's really sad. And they just have a skin of water in the scorching heat of the desert. And eventually the water runs out. Right, so at this point, once the water runs out, Hagar she can't bear to see her child die. And so what she does is she places him under a shrub, and she walks a little distance away. I think the text said the length of a bow shot. And she lifts up her voice and she weeps. You have to remember, I know it's not Sarah we're talking about, but she's a mom too. And she's weeping in the desert because she doesn't want to see her son die. I think of this story Mom tells about me when I broke my arm. And I was in the doctor's office. And were they resetting it? Was that what they were doing? Yeah, they needed to ER. They were resetting my arm. And Mom went to walk out because she didn't.
The doctor was making you.
Yeah, Oh, okay. So the doctor was making her leave, probably saying, you don't want to see this. Right. And so mom goes to leave, and I think the way you told it was I said, you're not going to leave me, are you, Mommy? And she said, no, I'm not leaving, And I think of that story. I also think of taking Mom to her appointment recently, and I really didn't want to stay in the waiting room. Because it's like that was then, but it's like I don't want to leave either. The reality is sometimes it's unbearable to see someone you care about in pain. That's the reality. And hopefully that helps you get in the headspace of Hagar here when she leaves her son in a shrub in the shade of a tree because she cannot possibly bear to see him, her little son, pass away. She can't bear to see him. And then right there in the silence of the wilderness, in a spiritual wilderness too, really, if you think about it, God speaks. He hears the cries of Hagar and Ishmael. He opens her eyes to a well of water she had not seen before, and he renews his promise to make Ishmael a great nation. It's an absolutely remarkable story. And from it we learn three things that I'm going to talk about today about God's dealings with us. First, the pain of rejection, how they must have felt. Right? The pain of rejection, and that even God's people experience brokenness and loss. Second, the despair of the wilderness, right? That our despair often reveals our dependence in a really good and healthy way, actually. Our despair often reveals our dependence on God. And third, the God who hears us and sees us, right? That his mercy meets us in the very places we think that we've been forgotten. Right? And so we begin, starting with verses 8 through 14. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. All right, so a very stark showing of the pain of rejection and how that must have felt for Hagar, to feel rejected in that way. So first, I want you to understand what this would mean for Isaac and Sarah, and this occasion, and kind of give it the benefit of the doubt, right? The last message in Genesis that I was preaching in with you all, when Isaac was born, I talked about how huge that was because of how long they waited, the covenant promise, and what would come from the nation of Israel. We talked about all of that. And it's obviously of great importance for that reason. But also, contextually speaking, it wasn't just a third or fourth birthday as we would think of it, or a celebration of this toddler starting to eat solid food. It's worth celebrating because of infant mortality at this time. You could think of being in ancient times having a baby who grew to 3 or 5 years old and is kind of starting to be independent health-wise, starting to eat solid food or things like that. I mean, it's huge. As a milestone in terms of him surviving a really crucial development, right? Babies would not often grow to be that. It's sort of like, if I know they made it here, okay, the baby's healthy, we're fine, And so that's what I'm saying, is like it's contextually important for that reason. He survived a crucial phase of development, and you kind of have confirmation that your child's in good health. And so it means a lot to them as parents. And in the midst of this pride and joy that they feel, Sarah looks over and sees Ishmael not taking it seriously, not caring at all, and maybe even mocking the whole thing. And you might think something like, boys will be boys, but there's actually a really significant worry here, right? You shouldn't read this as a really petty jealousy, or even though jealousy, I'm sure it was to some extent. But in the world of patriarchs, when things are inherited from the father to the eldest son and so on, Ishmael's still the oldest son. And so he's still going to feel a sense of claim over Abraham's inheritance, right? And so he will kind of scoff at something like this. It's a sacred matter. And so Ishmael, as Abraham's firstborn, might still claim a share in his father's estate, and more dangerously, a share in the covenant line, right? And so Sarah kind of senses this, right? Her women's intuition goes off, right? And she senses this, knowing that God's promise centers upon Isaac, and she demands that this family be cut off. And the way she goes about it, however, and stating this, it really speaks to a place of harshness by the severity, a sharpness probably from a really deep fear, right? She doesn't refer to them when she talks to Abraham. She doesn't refer to them as Hagar and Ishmael, right? She doesn't say cast out Hagar and Ishmael. She says cast out this slave woman with her son. Right, so you can feel the distance that she puts between her and these people, almost dehumanizing them in the way she speaks about them. It's really not a good look for Sarah once again. And so for this reason, Abraham, we're told, is very displeased, and he obviously would be, right, because Ishmael is his son too. Right, he held him as a baby, he taught him to walk, he watched him grow. And now he faces this really impossible decision between peace in his household and his own flesh and blood. Right? And so it's kind of frustrating even to read about, let alone to experience. And yet into that anguish, God speaks. In verse 12, he says to Abraham, "Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named." Again, at first glance, it sounds a little bit harsh, as though God is siding with Sarah's jealousy. But we have to see beyond the immediate, right? God isn't endorsing any sort of cruelty towards people here. He's preserving his covenant, right? So Ishmael will not share in the line of promise, but that doesn't mean he's cast off from the reach of God's care. In fact, God adds, "I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." And there's a lesson there for all of us, even today, that sometimes God permits painful separations in order to advance his redemptive purposes. There's going to be points where something or someone we love deeply must be let go. And even if you're someone who's really obedient, you're not going to find that as something that's easy to do. Abraham rose early in the morning, prepared provisions for Hagar and Ishmael, and sent them away. Right, so there's no record of any words spoken or exchanged. You only see his quiet obedience. As a person who trusted God, even when it obviously would be tearing at his soul. Right, so we don't. I think people sometimes have an unrealistic expectation of what Christianity looks like. That if you're really good at it, then it comes really easily. But really, if you're maturing in your faith, I probably wouldn't use the phrase getting really good at it, but if you're maturing in your faith, you just become more aware of how difficult it really is. You know what I mean? You become really aware of your faults. So we mustn't imagine here either that obedience always feels noble or serene or easy. As you may know, it most often feels a lot like heartbreak, because you have to let something go. You have to give something up. And so what this story does is it reminds us, even in our frustration and our anguish and our heartbreak, that God is not absent. And so we can take three things from this. First, that we can expect brokenness even in blessed households, even in Christian households, even in households that it's just God's people in there. You can expect brokenness. You can expect tension and difficulty. Right? This is Abraham's home. A home of faith, a home of promise, and yet it's marked time and time again by tension and tears and division. And some of you may be in households where you know this all too well. Right? The presence of God's blessing does not erase the presence of human frailty. That's just a fact. And second, when people reject us, it may actually be part of God's redirection. When people reject us, God actually might be blessing that and allowing that, because it's a way by which he's redirecting our lives. And we may not see it in the moment, but it doesn't mean it's any less true. Right? Hagar could not have imagined as she stumbled into the wilderness that God was leading her to a new chapter of mercy. And so we often look back on rejections that once felt unbearable, and then later on you're able to see that God was moving you out of something that would have hindered his purpose. And that's what's happening here. And third, on this point, that we can trust God's sovereignty in seasons of loss. Right? Abraham, even though God spoke to him, he still couldn't see the full picture. Right? He only knew that his obedience meant pain. And that's how it often is. It's like, I don't know what God has planned, but I know that it means I'm going to be in pain for a little while. I know that it's not going to be easy. I know that this hurts right now. I don't understand why he would put me through this, but he did, and it hurts. But I know he has a plan for me. That's sometimes just the reality of the Christian walk. He couldn't see the full picture. But later, when he heard that Ishmael had survived and even prospered, later on in Scripture, he would understand that God had been faithful on both sides of this divide. All right, so on this point, the pain of rejection, right? The pain of rejection, what have we learned about it? It's real. It's real. But in God's economy, rejection is never the final word. Rather, it's usually just a doorway through which his providence enters, quietly weaving redemption into the fabric of our tears and the fabric of our lives. So that's the pain of rejection. Now let's talk about the despair that's in the wilderness, right? In verses 15 and 16. When the water in the skin was gone, She put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of my child. And she sat opposite him. She lifted up her voice and she wept. So the narrative moves from Abraham and his household and now into the wilderness, right? So we have a different setting. It's a dramatic shift of scene and of tone. And it's on purpose because you can kind of feel it as the reader, right? This shift. We're not in Kansas anymore. We're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. It's just this stark, desolate place that you're brought to with Hagar and Ishmael. Right? One moment, they're under Abraham's roof, and the next, they're beneath the burning sun of Beersheba, and their water supply is gone. And so you can almost picture the horizon stretching out, an endless sand and silence. And verse 15 is really, really brief, but it says everything. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. All right, so you don't need much imagination at all to feel the weight of that. The last drop of water has been poured out. You can picture the skin that would hold it lying empty, and with it, the hope of survival. And she sets Ishmael under a bit of desert brush. Not enough to even provide him shade. It wasn't for shade. It was because she could not stand to see him suffer. And she steps away. She lifts up her voice and she weeps, saying, let me not see the death of the boy. All right, so this mother's watching her child die of thirst, basically. And she feels so helpless and powerless to do anything about it. And you have to understand, it's more than just physical right now, right? Not only is she literally in a desert, but spiritually she's in a desert. Spiritually she's wandering. She's lost. She feels rejected. All right, so it's a cry of spiritual desolation. The voice of someone who feels forgotten by everyone, including God. And some of us know of that wilderness, don't you? I mean, at some point or another in your life, some of you know that wilderness where it feels like everyone's forgotten you, even God. It's a tough place to be. It's not just a wilderness of sand and sun, but of isolation and emptiness and unanswered prayers. Right? She used to have the security of a home, what resembled a marriage, a friendship, and you could say the same, like maybe you used to have a more secure home. Maybe you used to have a marriage or a friendship or a stronger church family, or you were involved in this rich ministry, and now maybe you find yourself in a wilderness, wondering if you've been left behind in life. And you feel like you've run out of resources, and you feel like you're out of strength, and out of ideas, and out of tears, and somewhere in your heart you're saying what Hagar said, I can't watch this anymore. On the plane, since it was an international flight, they had movies you could watch on the back of the chair or whatever. And so I tried to watch several movies, but with the air pressure, I can't have headphones on very long. I can't do it. I don't know why. But so I was like, I'm not going to watch anything. I'll just get a headache. And so I waited, but then you get kind of bored, and so I saw someone else's screen, and they had subtitles on. And so instead of watching my own screen, I ended up just watching Gladiator 2 through the subtitles of someone else's screen. It's like a 3-hour movie, but I didn't watch the whole thing. It was really not as good as the first one, and it was terrible. And I I got to a point where I just said, like, I'm not going to watch this anymore. It's so bad that I don't even want to see the rest of this. Like, usually I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. Like, maybe it has a good enough ending. I'll stick around and just see where it lands. I've invested enough of my time. But for this movie was so bad that I was just like, I don't even want to see the rest of this. And I say that to say, it's pretty bad when that story is your own life, that you get to a point where you say, I don't even want to see the rest of this. And Hagar's at this point, right? Things go downhill so fast, and before you know it, you're crying out with prayers like hers. Now, a bad movie can be really poorly written. A bad movie can be poorly written. But I know the author of mine. And I know the author of yours. And what if I told you that the wilderness is often the proving ground of faith? That God allows us to come to the end of our resources so that we might discover His. And that until the water runs out, we don't know the value of a well. And until the noise fades, we can't hear the still small voice. It's a strange mercy. God will sometimes strip away every visible sign of His kindness so that we may learn that His kindness was never dependent upon things that He gave us. When He removes the supports, we find out it was really just Him holding us up all along. If you feel this way today or perhaps this week, I want you to hear me, beloved, when I say, don't mistake isolation for abandonment. You might feel isolated. You might actually be isolated, but it doesn't mean you're abandoned. The silence of the desert does not mean the absence of God. You may not see Him. You may not hear Him. You may feel that your prayers vanish into thin air as soon as you speak them, but He is nearer than you think. The same God who heard Hagar's cry in Genesis 16 still hears her sobs in Genesis 21. She may have forgotten His promise, but He had not forgotten her. You see, human despair is often the stage for divine intervention. God waits until our hands are empty before He fills them. He waits until our plans are exhausted before He unfolds His. And He waits until our self-sufficiency has died before His sufficiency is revealed. And so what do we do in the wilderness? We do what Hagar did. We weep, we wait, and we hope. Cry if you must. God can handle that. Rest if you must. He neither slumbers nor sleeps. But don't give up. Don't say, I'm not going to watch the end of this one. Because right when Hagar thought it was over, God was preparing to open her eyes. Your wilderness is not a wasted place. It is sacred ground where despair gives way to discovery, where emptiness becomes invitation, and where God, who seems silent, is bending low to listen to you. Last, let's look at verses 17 through 21. All right, we'll talk about the God who sees us all the while. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. All right, so at the moment that, when Hagar is most certain that all is lost and that everything is over, verse 17 tells us something astonishing. All right, and God heard the voice of the boy where he was. And that's a really beautiful last phrase. He heard him where he was. Not where he should have been, not where he wished he would have been, not where he hoped to be, but where he was. God met Ishmael in the exact spot of his desperation. And then we read, the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar?" Which is fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. All right, so the angel doesn't go there and rebuke her for weeping or say, "How dare you lack this faith?" Or, "Don't you know that God's up to something with your life?" Doesn't do anything like that. Doesn't rebuke her. He doesn't tell her to pull herself together. He meets her in mercy, and he offers what are perhaps the two most beautiful words in Scripture: fear not. Remember that this isn't the first time Hagar has met God in the wilderness. Right? We talked about this back in Genesis 16. She fled from Sarah's harsh treatment, and there by another spring of water she encountered the Lord who saw her. Right? It says God saw her, and she called him El Roi, the God who sees me. And now, years later, the same God who saw the mother now hears the cry of her son. Right? So you have seeing and hearing. Two sides of his divine compassion. He sees our tears and he hears our cries. And then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. Right? It probably likely had been there all along, But her despair, she was in such inner turmoil, she was blinded to its presence. You know how you're just not aware of things around you because you're so caught up on what's happening inwardly? Right, so God doesn't say he created a new source of water. He simply revealed what had been hidden. Right, so the problem was never a lack of provision on God's part, but the lack of sight on hers. And it's often how he works. In mercy, he meets us where we are, not by changing everything around us, right, our circumstances and things like that, and are shuffling the deck, but by helping us see what he's already given. So Hagar fills the skin, gives the boy water, and the narrative closes with hope. Right? And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Right? So I'm going to end here, because the application, quite frankly, is really clear here, because we've kind of built to this point. God often hears us before we can even pray. He reveals his provision when we cannot see it, and his care extends even to those whom the world forgets and rejects. We can trust him in seasons of loneliness, scarcity, fear. And though, like Hagar, we may not have all the answers, we can know that God is present and merciful and faithful to meet our every need. All right, so my prayer for you this week is that God's faithfulness in your places of rejection and despair and your need my prayer is for your awareness of his faithfulness in those circumstances, right? Because we know from this text that he hears the cries of the overlooked, he provides for us in our wilderness, and he keeps his promises. And therefore, whatever your season, it's pain or emptiness or uncertainty, you can trust that God sees you and cares for you and supplies exactly what you need in exactly the right time and meets you where you are. Let's pray.